They kept sending their water into my yard, so eventually, I sent it back. Not with a fight, not with a lawyer, not even with a raised voice, just a quiet little change that turned everything around. And the funny thing is, by the time they realized what was happening, it was already too late to pretend it wasn't their problem anymore. It started small, the kind of thing you almost feel silly even noticing, just a puddle. I remember standing at my kitchen window one late afternoon, coffee in hand, watching the tail end of a summer storm roll out, the kind we get here in central Texas where the sky just opens up like it's got something personal against your roof. And there it was, right near the back edge of my lawn, this wide, shallow puddle catching the last bit of gray light. I didn't think much of it at first. I mean, the ground was probably saturated. We'd had 3 storms that week already, and my yard had always drained a little slow compared to the front. Nothing unusual, nothing worth worrying about. By the next morning it was gone, soaked in like it always did, and I forgot about it just as quickly as it showed up. But then the next storm came, heavier this time, louder, the kind that rattles your windows and makes you double-check if you close the garage, and when I looked out back again, that puddle had turned into something else entirely. Not deep, not dangerous, but wide, too wide, stretching further into the lawn than I'd ever seen before, like the water had decided to settle in instead of passing through. 3 days, that's how long it took to disappear that time. 3 full days of stepping carefully around that soggy patch, feeling the ground give a little under my shoes, noticing how the grass started to yellow just slightly around the edges, like it wasn't meant to stay wet that long. That's when something in the back of my mind started to itch, not alarm bells exactly, just a quiet little question. Why here? And then I noticed the house behind mine. Now, that place had been under renovation for months, trucks coming and going, contractors in and out, the usual noise and dust that you learn to ignore after a while. But one afternoon, when the sun finally came out and everything dried enough to really see again, I took a closer look over the fence. Fresh concrete patio, clean lines, brand new gutters shining like they hadn't seen a single storm yet. And then there was that pipe. Long, white, maybe 6 inches across, sticking straight out from the back wall of their house like it had a purpose, like it knew exactly where it was pointing, and unfortunately, that direction was my yard. I remember squinting at it for a second, tilting my head a little, trying to decide if I was overthinking it. Maybe it was temporary. Maybe the contractor hadn't finished. Maybe it was just one of those things you don't understand unless you're in construction. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, went back inside, and let it go. Until the next storm. This time, I didn't just glance out the window. I watched. The rain started light, tapping against the glass, then picked up into that steady roar that fills the whole house with white noise. And sure enough, water began pouring off their patio, rushing along the edge like a guided path, and then it hit that pipe. And what came out the other end wasn't a trickle. It was a stream. A steady, forceful stream of water shooting straight into my yard, cutting through the grass like it had somewhere to be, like it had been told exactly where to go. I just stood there for a moment, coffee forgotten in my hand, watching it happen over and over again. The rhythm of it almost mechanical. Rain falls, water gathers, pipe fires, my lawn takes the hit. And the strangest part, their yard stayed dry. Clean, usable, almost untouched by the storm, while mine started to look like it was losing a fight it didn't sign up for. Now, I'm not the kind of guy who jumps straight into confrontation. I like to give people the benefit of the doubt, maybe more than I should sometimes. So the next morning, once things had settled down and the sun was out again, I walked over, knocked on their door, and introduced myself properly. The homeowner, his name was Derek, mid-40s maybe, polite enough on the surface, the kind of guy who smiles just a little too quickly like he's used to smoothing things over. He listened while I explained what I'd seen, kept nodding like he understood, but when I finished, he just shrugged slightly and said, "Yeah, the contractor told me that's standard drainage. Water's got to go somewhere, right? It just flows downhill." I remember pausing for a second, choosing my words carefully, trying not to sound accusatory. Sure, I get that, but this isn't exactly natural flow. That pipe's directing everything straight into my yard. He gave a small laugh, not rude, but dismissive enough to land wrong. I mean, it's still just rainwater. Everyone deals with it. And that was it, conversation over, at least on his end. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, feeling that first flicker of frustration settle in, Not hot, not explosive, just steady, like something that was going to take its time. On my way back, I glanced at that pipe again, still clean, still pointed exactly where it had been the day before, and I had this quiet realization creeping in. This wasn't going to fix itself. So I did what he suggested, or at least what he thought I wouldn't actually follow through on. I tracked down the contractor. Took a couple calls, a little digging, finally got a name from one of the guys who had been working the site, and a day later I'm standing in my driveway talking to this guy named Luis, who sounded like he'd already had this conversation before, just not with me. I explained the situation, kept it calm, even threw in a maybe I'm misunderstanding something here, just to keep things from getting tense too fast, and he listened, quiet, arms crossed, nodding slightly, then gave me the kind of answer that's technically correct but doesn't help you at all. Look, he said, everything we installed is up to code, gutters, drainage, the pipe, all of it. On their property, it's compliant. Once water leaves their boundary, it's considered surface flow. He said it like he'd said it 100 times, like it was the end of the discussion. Surface flow, I repeated, more to myself than to him. He nodded again. That's right. Now, I'm not a lawyer, not even close, but something about that phrase stuck in my head in a way I couldn't shake. Surface flow. Like once it crosses that invisible line between properties, it just becomes nobody's responsibility. Just nature doing its thing. Except it wasn't nature. It was a pipe. A very intentional, very precise pipe. I thanked him anyway, because what else was I going to do, and went back inside. But that conversation kept replaying in my head over the next few days, especially when the next storm hit, and the next, and the next. Each time, same pattern. Rain falls, their system collects it, that pipe fires it straight into my yard, and my lawn just absorbs it. Slower and slower each time. After one particularly heavy storm, I stepped outside and my shoe sank half an inch into the ground near the back fence. That wet, squishy sound you never want to hear on your own property. And when I pulled my foot back up, the grass came with it slightly, like the roots had given up trying to hold on. That's when it stopped being an annoyance. That's when it became a problem. A week later, that section of my yard was still damp, not flooded, not dramatic, just persistently wrong. The kind of damp that invites mosquitoes, that makes mowing a hassle, that turns a normal Saturday afternoon into something you start avoiding. And every time I looked at it, I could trace it back in my head like a map, from the lowest spot in my lawn, straight back to that pipe. So I started paying attention, not just casually, but deliberately. Next storm, I stood by the window with my phone and recorded it, steady shot, no commentary, just the visual, rain pouring down, water gathering. Then that sudden, focused stream blasting out of the pipe and hitting my yard like it had somewhere better to be. I took photos the next morning, close-ups of the pooling, wide shots showing how far it spread, timestamps, dates. I even made notes about how long it took for things to dry out afterward. At first, I wasn't sure why I was doing it. Part of me thought maybe I'd need it if things escalated. Another part of me just wanted proof, something solid that said, no, this isn't in your head. And then one night, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open, I decided to look it up. Just out of curiosity, local drainage rules, property runoff laws, that kind of thing. I figured I'd find something vague, something that basically said deal with it, like everyone else had implied. But that's not what I found. Turns out, in my county, there's a pretty clear distinction: water that spreads naturally across land. What they call diffuse flow, that's fine, expected even. But concentrating that water, collecting it, and then discharging it in a directed stream onto a neighboring property, that's different. That's not allowed. I remember leaning back in my chair, reading that section twice just to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting it, feeling this slow, quiet shift happen somewhere in my chest. Not excitement exactly, not even satisfaction, just clarity. For the first time since this whole thing started, I knew something they either didn't know or were hoping I wouldn't find out. Now, I could have filed a complaint right then. Sent in the videos, the photos, let the county handle it. Turn it into one of those drawn-out disputes where everyone ends up annoyed and nothing gets fixed quickly. But the more I thought about it, the less I liked that idea. Not because I didn't have a case, but because I didn't want to spend months arguing over something that could be solved a different way. And that's when I started looking at my yard differently. Not as the victim in this situation, but as part of the system. My property slopes gently toward the back fence. Nothing dramatic, just enough that water naturally wants to move in that direction. And beyond that fence, their yard sits just a little lower in one corner, especially along the side where their landscaping wasn't finished yet. Bare soil, uneven ground, the kind of spot you don't think about until it becomes important. I walked that fence line a few times over the next couple days, hands in my pockets, just observing, tracing the path water would take if it had a choice. And that's when the idea started forming. Not revenge, not exactly. More like correction. If they wanted to treat water like something you could direct, control, send wherever it was convenient, then maybe all I needed to do was show them what that actually looked like when the system worked both ways. So I called a landscaper. Nice guy. Older, named Frank. The kind of person who's been working with soil and drainage long enough that he doesn't need fancy explanations. I walked him through the situation, showed him the soggy section, pointed out the pipe over the fence, and he didn't say much at first, just nodded slowly, taking it all in. After a minute, he looked at me and said, "You don't need anything complicated, you just need to stop the water from settling here." I asked him what that would look like. He smiled a little, not in a mischievous way, more like he'd solved this problem 100 times before. "We build you a berm." Now, I'd heard the term before, but never really paid attention to it. He explained it simply. A raised strip of land, subtle, blends into the yard if you do it right, but underneath, it acts like a barrier, stops water from moving straight through, forces it to spread out, find another path. "Make it look nice," he added. "Stone edging, some plants. Nobody questions landscaping." That last part stuck with me. Nobody questions landscaping. So we planned it out. Nothing aggressive, nothing that would scream, "I'm doing this because of you." Just a gentle, slightly elevated garden bed running along the back fence line. On the surface, it would look like an upgrade. Underneath, it would be compacted soil and gravel, structured just enough to do exactly what I needed it to do. The work took a couple days. I watched parts of it from the same kitchen window where this whole thing started, noticing how carefully they packed the soil, how the gravel core sat hidden beneath everything, like a quiet little secret built into the yard. By the time they were done, it looked good. Better than before, actually. Clean, intentional, like it had always been part of the design. And if you didn't know what it was for, you'd never think twice about it. All that was left now was to wait for the next storm. The next storm didn't take long. It rolled in late on a Thursday afternoon, the sky going that heavy gray that feels like it's pressing down on everything. Air thick, quiet in that strange way it gets right before the rain starts. And I remember standing in the same spot by the kitchen window, almost out of habit at this point, coffee in hand again like some kind of ritual, just waiting to see what would happen. At first, it looked exactly the same. Rain hitting the roof, sliding down their gutters, collecting along the edge of that brand new patio. And then, right on cue, the pipe came alive. That same steady stream shot out, confident, direct, like it had no reason to expect anything different. Only this time, it didn't land the way it used to. It hit the berm. And instead of carving into my lawn, instead of pooling and spreading out into that familiar soggy patch, the water broke. It split sideways, flowing along the length of that raised edge, losing its force, stretching thinner as it moved, and then, slowly, almost casually, it followed the natural slope of the land, back toward the fence, and along it. I didn't move. I just stood there, watching the path redraw itself in real time, like a map being corrected. The water wasn't gone. It just wasn't mine anymore. It traveled along that fence line, guided but not forced, until it reached the lowest point, that unfinished corner of their yard, the one with bare soil and uneven ground. And there it settled. Not dramatically, not all at once, just gradually, turning that patch of their side yard into something very familiar. Damp, soft, a little inconvenient. The kind of wet that lingers just long enough to get your attention without crossing into damage. I remember exhaling without realizing I'd been holding my breath, not out of relief exactly, more like confirmation. It worked. And the best part, I hadn't broken a single rule. The storm passed, the sky cleared, and for the first time in weeks, maybe months, my yard looked normal. Grass upright, soil firm underfoot, no standing water, no lingering dampness. I walked out there the next morning just to be sure, stepping across the area that used to sink under my weight, and it held. Solid. I won't lie. There was a small moment, just a flicker, where I allowed myself to feel a little satisfaction. Not the loud, triumphant kind, just a quiet, internal, okay, that's better. 2 storms later, there was a knock on my door. I already knew who it was before I opened it. Derek stood there, hands on his hips, not angry exactly, but different. The easy smile was gone, replaced with something more measured, more aware. "Hey," he said, nodding slightly. "Got a minute?" I stepped outside, closed the door behind me. "What's up?" He hesitated for just a second, like he was choosing how to frame it, then said, "My side yard's been getting pretty muddy lately. Didn't used to be like that." I nodded slowly, not interrupting. He glanced past me toward the fence, then back. "Did you change something back there?" Now, this was the moment where a lot of people might have gotten defensive or sarcastic or turned it into a confrontation, but honestly, I didn't feel any of that. I'd already had my frustration weeks ago. This part was different. "I made some improvements to my landscaping," I said, keeping my tone even, almost casual, just to deal with the standing water I was getting, which was completely true. He held my gaze for a second longer than before, then exhaled slightly, like something had clicked into place. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I guess that makes sense." There was a pause, not awkward, but heavy enough to matter. Then he asked the question that, if I'm being honest, I'd been expecting since the day I first saw that pipe. "So what do you think it would take to fix this? Between us, I mean." And there it was. No more, that's just how water works. No more passing it off as nature or inevitability, just a straightforward acknowledgement that something needed to change. I leaned back slightly, crossed my arms, not in a defensive way, just thinking for a second before answering. "Honestly," I said, "that pipe, it needs to discharge into something on your property. A dry well, a soakaway, even a rain garden, anything that lets the water absorb before it gets pushed somewhere else." He nodded slowly as I spoke, like he'd already heard those terms before, maybe from the same contractor, maybe from someone else, but this time, it landed differently. "Yeah," he said again. "Okay." No argument. No pushback. Just acceptance. A week later, a crew showed up in his yard. Different company this time. I noticed that right away. They worked along the side of his house, digging out a section near where the pipe ended, setting up what looked like a gravel pit system, layers of stone designed to hold and slowly disperse water back into the soil instead of sending it on a one-way trip. I didn't watch the whole process, didn't feel the need to. I'd seen enough to know where it was going. The next time it rained, I still stood by the window out of habit, but this time, the pipe didn't fire the way it used to. The water disappeared underground before it ever reached the edge of his property. And just like that, the problem was gone. No more soggy patch in my yard. No more muddy corner in his. Just rain doing what it's supposed to do: fall, soak in, move on. Now, here's the part one still think about sometimes. I never filed a complaint. I never quoted the county regulations to him directly. Never turned it into a legal issue, even though I probably could have. And he never apologized, not in so many words, but he didn't need to. Because in the end, the outcome was the same. But every now and then, I wonder, if I had gone straight to the county, forced the issue from the beginning, would it have played out differently? Faster, maybe, but messy, eh? Would we have ended up as those neighbors who don't make eye contact, who keep score over every little thing? Or did this quiet adjustment, this indirect way of handling it, actually lead to something better? I don't know. What I do know is this: sometimes people don't really understand the impact of what they're doing until they feel it themselves. Not in a harmful way, not in a destructive way, just enough to make it real. And once it's real, solutions tend to come a lot quicker. So I'll leave you with that. If you were in my position, would you have handled it the same way? Or would you have gone straight to filing a complaint and let the system deal with it? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious where people land on this one. And if you enjoy stories like this, the kind that sit somewhere between everyday life and quiet payback, go ahead and hit like, subscribe, and stick around. There's always another story.